A terrible and shocking crime has been committed, and despite their best efforts, the police don't really have any idea who's behind it. And then another horrific crime is committed that's very similar to the first. Are they connected? Is this the work of a serial killer? So where do the police look for help? They turn to an expert. They turn to a forensic psychologist. Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. In this video we're beginning a series into forensic psychology, where we're going to explore different explanations for why people commit crimes, as well as controversial discussions about the effectiveness of prisons, as well as some interesting alternatives to prison. But first, we're starting with offender profiling. Offender profiling is an investigative technique that produces a description of the characteristics of an offender based on the crime scene and other data to help narrow down the list of suspects. There are two main approaches to offender profiling that we're going to explore, and this is going to get heated because we're going to compare the American version used by the FBI, called the top-down approach, with the British alternative called the bottom-up approach. We'll explore a real-life case where a forensic psychologist produced a remarkably close profile of the criminal, and sadly, another case where things went terribly wrong. But just before we begin, it's appropriate to give you a warning that given the nature of this topic, some of the content in this video and in this series is going to cover some dark criminal behaviour that you may find disturbing. The American approach used by the FBI is known as the top-down approach. It's called the top-down approach because they start with a template before they analyse the crime. In other words, they have a pre-existing category or typology through which they see the crime scene. These typologies or types are called organised and disorganised offenders. Well, where did they get this typology from? In the 1970s, the FBI established its behavioural science unit in Quantico, Virginia. The FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood was credited with classifying serial homicide crime scenes into organised and disorganised types. This typology of organised and disorganised was then studied further by FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Resler, who in the 1980s conducted prison interviews with convicted serial sexual murderers, which included the likes of Ted Bundy. They wanted to investigate whether there were behavioural differences at the crime scenes between organised and disorganised murderers, and to identify variables that may be useful in profiling organised and disorganised murderers. In total, they interviewed 36 convicted sexual murderers, 7 of whom had killed one person, with the remaining 29 having killed multiple victims. They concluded from their research into these 36 criminals that behavioural and personality characteristics can be determined from evidence at a crime scene. So what does this crime scene look like for an organised and disorganised offender, and what are the characteristics of these people? Here is a list of some of the crime scene behaviours of an organised offender. And here is a list of the personality characteristics. And here is a list of some of the crime scene behaviours of a disorganised offender. And here is a list of their personality characteristics. So how effective has the top-down approach been? Now it's time to introduce you to this man, David Canter, one of the foremost experts on offender profiling. And he's British, by the way. In 2004, he conducted a piece of research with colleagues called The Organised Disorganised Typology of Serial Murder, Myth or Model. In this research, they tested the typology approach with the data from 100 serial killings in the United States. What they found was that there was no distinct pattern in the data for an organised and disorganised murderer. Instead, they found that organisation is a characteristic typical of most serial killers. This research therefore questions the accuracy of the organised and disorganised distinction for offender profiling and suggests alternative methods are needed for profiling. The top-down approach has been further criticised in terms of its original sample. This is because it's based on interviews conducted by FBI agents with 36 serial sex murderers, which is a rather limited sample, which makes it harder to generalise. It means that the top-down approach can only be applied to sexually motivated serial killers and not other crimes. Furthermore, the data was only based on American men, which raises questions about how the behaviours and personalities of serial killers may differ in women and in other cultures. Also, questions need to be asked about how reliable the interview data is, as it's based on self-reports from serial murderers in prison. After all, many of these people, such as Ted Bundy, are known for being very skilled verbally and for being highly manipulative. An alternative approach to offender profiling is the British bottom-up approach, associated with the work of, can you guess, David Canter. In contrast to the top-down approach with its fixed typologies of organised and disorganised, the bottom-up approach doesn't start with that assumption, but rather starts with the details of the crime and works up to build an understanding of the offender from there. This involves what David Canter called investigative psychology. This uses psychological theory and statistics to analyse crime scene evidence and generate a database of criminal behaviour patterns. What does that mean? Well, how can investigators work out if a series of crimes were all committed by the same person? This is where a data-driven approach is needed. What you need, according to Canter, is a statistical database that records details about crimes. This then enables them to identify patterns that occur across crime scenes. When a crime is committed, it can be compared with this database for any similarities, which can then be used to make predictions about the characteristics of an offender. This statistical information helps find relationships between crimes. Furthermore, investigative psychology assumes something called interpersonal coherence. This is the idea that the way the offender behaved at the crime scene will be consistent with how they behave in everyday life. For example, if an offender was highly controlling with the victim during the crime, they would expect them to be controlling with other people in their everyday life too. The bottom-up approach also involves geographical profiling. This is the study of spatial behaviour in relation to crime and offenders, also known as crime mapping. It uses crime scene location and local knowledge to allow inferences to be made about the offender, such as where the offender lives, works, and socialises. It assumes that offenders will operate in the areas they know and are familiar with. For example, look at this map in southwest London and the location of these crimes. How many offenders do you think there are? You might want to pause the video here and have a think for yourself, but what potential inferences might this geographical information provide to help narrow down the list of suspects? You could make a case that there are 3 offenders, but actually there's 1. Can you see anything that links the 3 circles? Notice that the crimes are all close to a train or tube line. Well, not too telling, seeing as this is London, but maybe they work for the train line. But also notice that there is a library near each area. Perhaps this means the offender travels by train and regularly uses the libraries in each location, or even works at the different libraries. Again, it's all inference and it might not be completely correct, but it helps narrow down the list of suspects. Furthermore, geographical profiling considers what's called circle theory. This is the idea that offenders tend to commit crimes within a limited spatial area that goes out from where they live. Plotting the crimes on a map can allow for a centre of gravity to be identified as to the location of where the offender lives. This includes the notion that offenders could be marauders, where they have a home-based location that they commit crimes out from, or commuters, where they have travelled a distance away from their home base. All of this is based on schema theory. For more detail on schemas, you can check out the video on the cognitive approach, which I've linked below in the description. But in short, schemas are organised units of knowledge that we've developed through experiences. They help us make sense of the world so that we can predict what is going to happen and know how to respond appropriately. And so too for a criminal. They would have a schema for how to do their job, how to travel and how to get around a town, where to get food and how to talk and interact with other people. Psychologists like David Canter would take all the information from investigative psychology, using all the data about other crimes, as well as the information provided about the location of the crimes, to then produce a mental map of the offender. In other words, to predict what the schemas might be. So has the bottom-up approach and the work of David Canter been successful? Has it helped identify offenders and stop horrific crimes? Let's consider the famous case of John Duffy, who was known as the railway rapist. He committed 24 sexual attacks and 3 murders in North London. But at the time, the police were struggling to find the offender. They brought in David Canter to help, who analysed the geographical information from the crime scenes, and he also used his investigative psychology technique to analyse the data the police had from all other similar crimes. Whilst Canter was creating the profile, another attack took place, and Canter proposed the following profile: that they lived in the area near to the crime, they were a marauder, they were married with no children, they had marriage problems, they were isolated with few friends, they were a martial artist or bodybuilder, they were physically small, had a semi-skilled job, and had knowledge of railways and a previous criminal record. This led them to arrest John Duffy, who was known to the police because of a crime he'd committed previously with his ex-wife. So how close was David Canter's profile to the offender? Amazingly close. Originally, Duffy was placed 1,505th on a list of 2,000 suspects, but thanks to the work of the bottom-up approach and the work of David Canter, this narrowed down the list of suspects and helped identify the criminal, John Duffy. At this point, we can compare the top-down and bottom-up approaches to offender profiling, and we can see some interesting differences which have led some to argue for the superiority of the bottom-up British approach. Firstly, the FBI's top-down typology approach is based on the arguably unreliable interview data of the murderers they interviewed, as well as the intuition of the profiler. In contrast, the bottom-up approach is based on psychological theory, as seen in mental mapping and schemas, as well as statistical analysis of crime scene data. This allows it to be more objective and scientific in its attempt to create an offender profile. Secondly, the top-down approach is based on a limited sample of 36 serial sexual murderers, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a rather limited sample to generalise to, resulting in it only being applicable to sex-related murderers and not other types of criminals. In contrast, the bottom-up approach, with its investigative psychology and geographical profiling, is not limited to one particular type of crime, and therefore it could be argued is more effective in aiding the police in identifying offenders. However, caution is needed with offender profiling. While there have been successful cases of its use, like with John Duffy, sadly there have been cases where things have gone terribly wrong. This brings us to the brutal murder of Rachel Nickell in Wimbledon Common in the summer of 1992, who had her 2-year-old son with her at the time. This high-profile case that captured the media and the public's attention led to the police desperately trying to identify the man behind the crime. This led them to bring in a forensic psychologist called Paul Britton, who produced a profile of an offender which eventually led to the man called Colin Stagg. So convinced they were that Colin Stagg was the offender that this led them to try to trap him in a confession through the undercover work of a female police officer. When the Colin Stagg case went to trial in 1994, the judge concluded that the police had shown excessive zeal and tried to incriminate Stagg by deceptive conduct of the grossest kind, and Colin Stagg was declared to be not guilty and free from any criminal charge. Whilst the police were so focused on Colin Stagg as a result of the work of the forensic psychologist to the exclusion of other potential suspects, the real criminal went on to commit another murder. It wasn't until 2008 that Robert Napper, who was in prison at the time for another murder, was convicted of the murder of Rachel Rachel Nickell. Subsequently, the police issued a public apology to Colin Stagg. This case shows that caution is needed with offender profiling, as it's not always accurate and has the potential to mislead. There is a danger in sticking too close to the profile created by the forensic psychologist that other people can be missed. As a result, some have argued that offender profiling should never be used on its own in isolation to identify a suspect, but rather as one tool among many to help the police. So that's how psychologists can help the police catch criminals. But why do people commit crimes? Some have pointed to the role of biology. So in the next video, we're going to begin to explore a man called the father of criminology and some rather odd-looking faces. To watch that video, you can click on the screen now, and for more resources to help you understand and explore psychology, check out the Bear It In Mind website, linked below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one.